Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Anwarul Hoda, who is a professor at a very well-known think tank, ICRIER, and more importantly, he was Deputy Director General at the WTO in the 90s when India had signed many agreements at the WTO, including the agreement on agriculture. So he's the right man to really tell us what is the current controversy all about, where India is pitted against some of the developed countries like the US and EU on some of the critical agreements that are to be signed at the WTO. Welcome to our show, Mr. Anwarul Hoda. So you are the man who was there in the 90s, looked very closely at the agreement on agriculture, and historically we are talking about some of those provisions today in the context of India refusing to sign the Global Trade Facilitation Agreement of the WTO, and the American politicians were here, and the Americans have expressed disappointment that India has not signed the TFA, only country not to have signed the TFA. They are holding India responsible. So what's going on? How do you read this whole controversy?
Actually, as far as India and the trade facilitation agreement are concerned, it is not that India is not willing to sign the trade facilitation agreement. India has already said that it is agreeable to signing the trade facilitation agreement. But it has a bigger concern.
Yeah.
The bigger concern is in relation to certain obligations that arise from an existing agreement in the WTO agreement, the agreement on agriculture.
Which is the agreement on agriculture?
Which India believes.
Which was signed when? It was
1995, it entered into force in 1995, having been signed in 1994. India believes that the way the agreement on agriculture has panned out, it is going to restrict its freedom in providing food security and in providing support to its farmers.
Okay. How is that? Can you explain?
So, yes, I'll come to that. I'll just say that this is a classic case of what is known as issue reciprocity. Earlier also, in the negotiations leading to the WTO itself, there was this, that India was interested in liberalizing trade in textiles and other labor-intensive products, whereas the United States and other developed countries were interested in liberalizing services and in having rules on intellectual property rights. So this was the classic case of issue reciprocity, as it is known.
They talk about issues of their interest, they talk about issues of our interest.
So a similar thing has arisen now. Now the developed countries, and I must say that a large number of developing countries also are interested in pushing ahead with the trade facilitation agreement, whereas India, we are agreeable to pushing ahead with trade facilitation agreement.
Which the Prime Minister also said.
That's right.
TFA is good for India.
That's right. But we would like at the same time our concerns on the agreement on food security to be looked at. That is the issue.
Simultaneously, yeah.
That's how the two have been linked.
Okay. Now tell me, can you just explain to us in simple terms as to what is the main issue at stake? Now, when you talk about agriculture subsidies, it is acknowledged by everybody that the US and European Union, they are much bigger villains in the use of subsidy as to distort prices, right? So I believe US and EU give $1 billion a day of subsidies. So their annual subsidies go beyond $350 billion. I don't know the exact figure, you might throw light on that. Now, so some people say it's the case of pot calling the kettle black. How do you read this? When they blame India, it's actually the pot calling the kettle black. It's one argument.
Well, actually, people are a bit puzzled as to why the biggest subsidizers of agriculture have put India in this position, that India is feeling the heat on its domestic support program. But the way it has happened is this, that it is not that India has increased its trade distorting subsidies so much as to impinge on the interest of these major global players. But there are some technicalities involved. And in the technicalities, there are certain issues of concern to India. For instance, one of the obligations that countries like India have, countries which did not have much subsidies at the time the WTO agreement was formed, they were put on a discipline that, okay, if you are not undertaking any commitment to reduce your domestic support program, as others are doing, as the developed countries mainly were doing, then at least you will have this discipline on you that you will not increase your subsidies above 10%, separately on product specific basis and on product non-specific basis.
So in a sense, they were supposed to come down and meet somewhere midway.
That's right. They were supposed to bring it down, and we were supposed
to take it up.
Yeah, we had flexibility to take it up to 10% separately on product specific. And now 10% of what? 10% of the value of agricultural production. Now, which itself was rising. The value rises within.
But sir, can I ask you one question here? One problem which India has got itself into, maybe other developing countries also, is that we committed a price, a cap as it were, a price cap which government could pay the farmers for procuring food grains in 1988, and we are now not being allowed to increase the cap to factor in normal inflation, right? Now, how did India get into that agreement? How could we commit to a price cap without factoring in inflation over the next 10-15 years? I think that is the main problem today, isn't it?
That's the crucial point. The agreement says that the basis of calculation of this 10% will be the price that prevailed in the years 86 to 88.
88, yeah.
In nominal terms. Okay. In nominal terms. Now, that point was.
It should have been in real terms.
Yes, that point was put really to restrict the subsidization of the developed countries further, because the idea was to let inflation erode into whatever capacity they had. Now, even at that time, it was realized that this might hurt
the developing countries
countries where inflation is there.
And so how do countries like China responding to this?
For that only, there is a provision. There is a provision in the WTO agreement on agriculture that where there is excessive rates of inflation, due consideration will be given and the excessive rates will be taken into account.
Because you must have noticed in the last 15 years, developing countries have had much higher inflation as compared to the developed world. So So, do you say that we
It is not only compared to them, but it is this, that if we had a support price of say 1,000 rupees per ton for paddy or something, I am just giving a notional this thing. Today the support price is 6 times that, 600%. Now we in ICRIER have made calculations and we believe that the inflation fully covers us.
Okay.
So it is only a question of people, the other side, giving us full
allowance for inflation?
yes, allowance for the inflation that has occurred. Now,
And this is one of the key issues in this whole
this is the
controversy.
key issue. This is the key
That
issue.
we are fighting for a full allowance of inflation in the last 15 years to be able to give a much higher price to farmers for procuring wheat, rice,
That's right.
and other items, right?
Now, in the debates that have been taking place, people have been raising such points as to, okay, the rules allow that excessive inflation when it is there, then we should give due allowance. Now, what exactly is excessive? What exactly is due? So, it looked as if these people are making it difficult for us.
So these terminologies are somewhat vaguely worded in the WTO agreement. So we'll take a small break and come and discuss this in greater detail. Please don't go away and keep watching RSTV. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are speaking to Mr. Anwarul Hoda, a former Deputy Director General at the WTO and presently Professor at ICRIER, a very well-known think tank in Delhi. Mr. Hoda, so the key issue really is, as you have outlined, whether India can get a much higher price, Indian government can get a much higher price allowance to pay farmers for procuring food to run our food security based on inflation factored into the cap which was set in 1988. So we need, after 1988, the inflation factor has to be loaded, and that much higher price the government should be allowed to pay. Now you are saying that there is a clause in Agreement on Agriculture which says due allowance for inflation should be given. Now why is it so vaguely worded? Why can't the West understand that due allowance for inflation means full allowance for inflation? And wasn't this discussed at Bali last December?
Yeah, these are the things that have to be thrashed out. At Bali, what happened was that the trade facilitation agreement was adopted, and there was the same issue that India wanted its concerns to be addressed
On the food security.
on the food security front. Now, on the food security front, two things were agreed. First, that the issue will be addressed and a final solution found before the 11th ministerial conference in 4 years' time.
4 years' time, yeah.
Another thing was agreed that in the interim, developing countries would have an immunity from disputes being filed on this aspect.
So nobody could file disputes against, say, India in the intervening period.
That's
if India breached the 10% cap.
That was the famous peace clause, which was also put in there. Now, what happened on the 31st of July was that, as envisaged at Bali, the agreement on trade facilitation was put up for approval of what is known as the amendment protocol.
Okay.
Not to approve it, but to affix it to the WTO agreement,
And take it for ratification to various countries.
so that individual members could take it to their authorities for ratification. Now, at that stage,
it was a kind of in principle agreement.
that's
isn't
right.
It? Yeah.
That's right. It was really a procedural agreement, because the real agreement had already, in principle, had been already made at Bali.
So then what happened?
At that stage, what India said was that, look, we have been discussing the problems of food security in the meantime while these things are progressing. And we do not have assurance from the reactions that we have had that we are not fully assured that a final solution will really be found in the time frame in which it has been agreed.
So India expressed doubts whether a final solution will come within 4 years.
That's right. That's why it said
so India wanted the 4 years clause to be removed, right?
India wanted that when you agree with this, you also agree with this. Find a solution along with the procedures for finally adopting and ratifying the trade facilitation agreement. Now, this was the basis on which the talks broke down. This was the background, because the developed countries were not agreeable to making this peace clause completely coterminous with finding of a final solution, because they were not agreeable to removing this temporariness from the peace clause.
Okay. So what is happening now? There are reports that India is willing to look for a solution, kind of compromise solution by September. That's what the newspaper report said. So what can happen in September now? Do you think some midway solution could be found where the developed countries meet India halfway and give some assurance, simultaneous assurance on food security while signing TFA?
Well, certainly there are ways in which they can reassure India that the concerns relating to this price, 86, 88 price. And I must say that there are other ways also of addressing the problem. Now, those ways will involve amendment of the agreement. Now, but if they only look at the inflation factor, then that may not involve an amendment of the agreement, because it is already there in the agreement.
Yeah, there is a clause which says due allowance shall be given for inflation.
That's right, for excessive rates of inflation.
So why can't, Mr. Hoda, why can't developing countries get together and force this issue on the US and EU, the developed countries who are being cussed, saying that just define what due allowance for inflation means.
In fact, the G33 countries, of which India and China are members, have submitted a number of proposals, including how to give due allowance
for inflation.
For inflation.
But isn't it something so logical? Inflation gets factored in every economic.
Absolutely, but
in any price determination, which any economics graduate would say instantly, yes, inflation should be factored in. So why such cussedness on this?
Absolutely. I mean that negotiators will be negotiators, and they will always like to make it tough, make it sound more tough than what is it intended to be. Because law is one thing, and the treaty law is one thing, and economics behind that is quite another.
Yeah, sure.
So
the politics behind it, yeah.
Politics and the economics behind it. Because
well, I'll come to politics, because there is a view, Mr. Anwarul Hoda, that the US and EU, at the end of the day, are not very serious about making WTO work. Their past behavior, the way in the past talks have failed prior to elections in the US or such other political factors which interfered. And now people are saying that maybe United States wants some regional forums like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Transatlantic Partnership to act as a substitute to WTO. Now, how do you respond to that?
That certainly was the analysis at one time, that in the multilateral dialogue that takes place in the WTO, there was a feeling that individual countries can block progress, so not much progress is possible. Therefore, let's have trade agreements amongst a smaller group of countries, and that would be more successful in liberalization. And it was for that reason that the United States in particular, the leadership there was putting more political weight behind the Trans-Pacific Agreement. And more lately, they have started putting the political weight behind the transatlantic dialogue.
Which is US-EU, right?
US-EU only. And but I must say that even those agreements, those talks are not progressing as fast.
There's a counter view that you can't have a trade agreement, say, among aging societies work, because you need India and China in any substantive trade agreement to enhance global, GDP gains or trade gains, because the whole economic activity is incrementally happening here. So how can there be a trade agreement between, economies which have reached a plateau,
You see, one of the motivating factors behind the transatlantic dialogue is the rise of China. China is now such a massive economic entity. For instance, that in 2 years' time, it is expected that the car production in China will be more than that of United States and all the European countries combined. Now, this is the type of thing that they are dealing with. They say that let's combine US and EU so that we are still the premier economy in the world. So that is the real reason. But
and so coming back to food security, there is also a narrative that is coming from the West, which is that by and by the West will reduce their high food subsidy levels. They can't sustain it because it's expensive, and they want the southern hemisphere actually to grow its agriculture productivity and then feed the northern hemisphere, as it were. So do you subscribe to that theory or that expectation that after 20-30 years the southern hemisphere will grow all the food and feed the northern hemisphere? If we have to do that, maybe we'll also have to increase our subsidies substantially.
Actually, the fact of the matter is that with climate change coming, the expectation is that the production of food in the hotter tropical climates is going to go down. And what is more which may appear to be surprising, but it's more ironical, that the production of food in the temperate zones will go up. So
it could be the other way around.
it could be the other way around, but certainly subsidy is not the basis on which production of food should be pursued.
That's what the West has done in the last 30-40 years.
That's what they did.
Yeah, and they're correcting themselves.
They are correcting.
They're stopping us from doing the same. Yeah.
But at the same time, let me say that the situation has changed completely in the world food economy from the time the WTO agreement was negotiated. 86, 88, and you remember those 2 years, that period was the period of historic low prices. Prices had never been lower than that.
Now it's...
And you know what has happened now?
It's on a higher side, yeah.
That the prices have been historically high in 2 or 3 spells. So there is
that gives India a further reason to give higher prices to farmers. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it is not only that this 86, 88 thing needs to be looked at,
But the general increase in food
but
prices.
the whole agreement has to be revised because it was negotiated at time of low prices and now it is at
Even the whole dynamics have changed. So let us hope that that the whole agreement is re-looked at and the developing countries come together on that. Thank you very much, Mr. Anwarul Hoda, for talking to us and giving us all these interesting details. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with you next week. Thanks for watching.